The town of Coldbridge wasn't remarkable, not by a long shot. Its population hovered around 2,000, give or take a few, and its greatest claim to fame was a half-collapsed covered bridge dating back to the 1800s. But beneath its surface of peeling paint and overgrown lawns, there was a hum, a current of something, not quite wrong, but off. And for some reason, every new arrival felt it before they could name it. Claire Arden felt it on her first day back in town. She hadn't been to Coldbridge in nearly a decade, not since her father's funeral. But her mother's recent fall demanded her return, however begrudgingly. "You'll be fine here for a while," Claire said, trying to sound reassuring as she unloaded a suitcase in her childhood bedroom. The room felt smaller than she remembered, the wallpaper's floral pattern somehow more oppressive. "Just until you're steady enough to get around on your own." Her mother, seated stiffly in a recliner by the window, didn't respond. She just nodded, her face pale and expressionless. It was a far cry from the lively woman Claire had grown up with, the mother who'd taught her how to bake cookies and had always been quick with a sharp-witted comment. "You're sure everything's okay?" Claire asked, kneeling beside her. "Maybe we should go back to the hospital for a follow-up?" "I'm fine," her mother said at last. Her voice was flat, clipped, as if she were reading from a script. Her lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Claire's stomach twisted. Something about the way her mother moved, the slight stiffness in her gestures, reminded her of a marionette being guided by invisible strings. But she shook the feeling off. The fall must have shaken her up worse than she thought. Time would fix it. It had to. The first real crack in the facade came 2 days later. Claire was making tea in the kitchen when she heard a faint tapping sound from the living room. She set the kettle down and walked quietly to the doorway, peeking in. Her mother sat in her recliner, staring blankly at the muted television. But her hands, they weren't still. They moved in precise, jerky motions, tapping out a pattern on the armrest. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap. Tap tap tap. Claire watched for a moment, the rhythm scratching at something primal in her brain. It felt familiar but wrong, like a nursery rhyme sung in reverse. "Mom," she said, stepping into the room. Her mother's hands froze mid-motion, and she turned her head toward Claire with a slow, deliberate precision. "Yes, dear? What were you doing just now?" Her mother blinked, then looked down at her hands as if noticing them for the first time. "Oh, nothing," she said, smiling again. That same unnatural smile. "Just thinking." Claire nodded slowly, her unease growing. She decided to let it go for the moment, but the strange tapping stayed with her long after she'd gone to bed. By the end of the week, Claire's discomfort had blossomed into outright dread. Her mother's behavior grew stranger by the day. She'd sit for hours, staring at the wall or out the window, only to suddenly spring into motion and clean the same surface over and over until Claire stopped her. She didn't eat much, and when she did, her movements were robotic, almost rehearsed. The worst part, though, was the conversations. Her mother responded to questions and made small talk, but her words felt off. Like an actor fumbling through a role they didn't quite understand. When Claire mentioned childhood memories, her mother's answers were close enough to be plausible but lacked the warmth or detail she'd expected. It was like talking to a stranger wearing her mother's face. One night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Claire woke up and decided to check on her mother. She padded softly down the hall and peeked into the living room. Her mother wasn't in her chair. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of floorboards. Claire's heart pounded as she moved toward the kitchen, where the dim glow of the refrigerator light spilled onto the linoleum floor. Her mother stood there, perfectly still, facing the counter. She didn't turn when Claire entered the room. "Mom?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother turned slowly, her movements mechanical. Her face, illuminated by the fridge light, was unnervingly blank, her eyes unfocused. Then she smiled, too wide, stretching her lips unnaturally. "I'm fine, dear," she said, her voice lilting in a way that sent chills down Claire's spine. "Just fine." And then, in a single, fluid motion, she tilted her head back and began to laugh. It was a high-pitched, hollow sound, like glass shattering in slow motion. Claire stumbled back, her blood turning to ice. Something was very, very wrong with her mother. And Claire was beginning to suspect it wasn't her mother at all. Claire fled the kitchen, her heart racing with a mix of fear and confusion. She locked herself in her bedroom, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She thought about calling the hospital, asking them to send someone to check on her mother. But something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of what they might say, "She's fine, it's just a side effect of the medication." Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that something was off. As she paced back and forth in her room, her mind replayed the events of the past few days. Her mother's robotic movements, the unnatural smile, the conversations that felt like scripted lines. It was as if her mother had been replaced by a thing. A machine. A puppet. Claire's eyes landed on an old photograph on her dresser. It was a picture of her and her mother, taken on a family vacation to the beach when she was a kid. Her mother's eyes sparkled in the photo, and her smile was warm and genuine. Claire felt a pang of sadness and loss. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing her mother, not just to old age or illness, but to something more sinister. She thought about all the times she'd seen her mother do things that seemed off. Not just the tapping or the conversations, but little things like leaving the cap off the toothpaste or wearing the same outfit 2 days in a row. Claire's mind reeled as she tried to piece together what might be happening. Was her mother somehow replaced? Was it some kind of experiment? Or was it something more organic? As she stood there, lost in thought, Claire heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside her room. It was soft at first, but grew louder and more insistent. She approached the door cautiously, listening. The scratching grew louder still, until it sounded like fingernails on wood. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the sound was coming from outside her door. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that she wasn't alone in the house. She slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open, peering out into the hallway. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Claire's eyes scanned the hallway, but there was no one in sight. She took a deep breath and stepped out into the hallway, her senses on high alert. That's when she saw it. A figure standing at the top of the stairs, watching her with an unnervingly blank expression. Claire's breath quickened as she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her instinct screaming at her to flee. The figure at the top wasn't just her mother, it was something else entirely. The way the dim light cast shadows across its face distorted familiar features into something alien and grotesque. "Mom?" Claire's voice trembled, each word resonating with disbelief. "What happened to you?" Instead of answering, the figure tilted its head, and suddenly the smile cracked into a snarl, jarring and unnatural. Streaks of unrecognizable dark matter dripped from the corners of its mouth as it stepped forward, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming, rancid stench. "Come, Claire," it said in a voice that echoed all too maliciously, layered with the softness of maternal concern fused with a sinister edge. "We have waited so long." As it took a step down, Claire's stomach churned with both revulsion and fear. The figure was tall and elongated, limbs unnaturally long, almost stretched as if someone had pulled a puppet's strings too far. Each movement was predatory, oozing with a hunger that sent a shiver down her spine. "No. You're not my mother," Claire shouted, taking a step back. "Get away from me." Laughter reverberated from the figure, a sound that made Claire's heart race. It wasn't joyous. It was mocking, as if the very concept of love and family had been twisted into something vile. More shadows began to emerge, shadow people with the same elongated limbs and sinister features, their eyes black voids sucking in light. "Let us show you," the figure crooned, gesturing with a crooked finger that flickered like a flame. "You've been searching for the truth, haven't you? Now you can truly see." With that, the walls around her began to shudder and quake, the very fabric of the house warping under pressure as memories came flooding back to Claire. She was trapped in a kaleidoscope of images, her mother cooking in the kitchen, her father laughing at the table, her brother riding his bike outside. But each image twisted and morphed, colors bleeding into chaos, laughter turning to screams, smiles contorting into malicious glares. "Stop it." Claire instinctively pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out the cacophony. This isn't real. But the shadows tightened around her, spinning the memories into a whirlwind of torment. Her mother's face morphed in front of her, showing the agony of a mental collapse. Claire saw every moment of fear, every medication bottle and therapy session that had come to define them. "Look closer," the figure hissed, pulling her into the vortex of memories. "Feel the truth." Claire fought against the tide, her heart racing as she was pulled deeper into the chaos. Suddenly, the memories shifted again, and she found herself in the damp confines of a dark room, cold, sterile. She could hear her mother's voice, thick with despair. "I can't take it anymore," her mother had cried, the sound echoing in Claire's mind. "I don't want to feel this way." Then, flashes of distress unfolded, her mother with wild eyes, shaking violently, holding her head as if trying to keep it together, begging for relief. Claire, still a child, helplessly watching as the weight of the world crushed the woman she loved. "It's your fault." The voice of the figure sliced through the air, frigid and relentless. "You never saw. You never helped. You made her suffer." "No." Claire screamed, but the walls tightened around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. "This isn't real." A wicked smirk spread across the figure's face as it approached her, inching closer. The shadows tangled into a mass of claws, reaching toward Claire with a hunger that chilled her to the core. "It is real, Claire. The memories, the suffering, you cannot escape it," it screeched, its voice resonating with a distorted echo of her mother's laughter. Summoning every ounce of strength, Claire pushed through the fear. In a sudden moment of clarity, she understood, the figure before her was a manifestation of all the anguish she had tried to ignore. It was the trauma that had festered beneath the surface, and it couldn't be fought with screams or denial. "No!" Claire bellowed, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "You are not my mother. You are a lie." With a surge of determination, she whipped around, facing the swirling memories head-on. I see you for what you are. You can't control me. The shadows recoiled at her declaration, the air suddenly sparking with intensity. Claire turned her back on the figure, tearing herself free from the suffocating memories, racing toward the far wall, the only way out of this madness. She crashed against it, pressing forward as the darkness rumbled behind her, furious at her defiance. The memories shattered around her like glass, fragments of the past exploding into a bright light, pushing the shadows back. With a final push, Claire lunged forward, breaking through the boundary of anguish. She stumbled into the cool night air, collapsing onto the dewy grass outside. The stars sparkled above her, twinkling with a promise of freedom. She gasped for breath, the weight of terror lifting as she realized she was alone. Behind her, the shadows writhed and twisted within the house, and for the first time, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. She might have left the darkness behind, but she knew she couldn't erase it. It would always be a part of her. Yet for now, she was free, and she could choose how to carry her past moving forward, a choice the figure would never understand. As Claire turned her back on the house, she finally took a step into the light, determined to move forward without the chains of those memories binding her. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it as her own, unburdened by the grotesque echoes of the life left behind.